So the world incites his appetite. So the masked man has an insatiable appetite. And we'll go this way, right? The masked man has an insatiable appetite, one, and also, it's not just the case that his appetite is insatiable, but there is no obstruction for him. We should be able to understand this a lot more readily now, right? Here's the masked man. He is within a world, and we're now talking about geographical world, right? With physical borders, land, water, so on and so forth. He finds himself within a world, and he recognizes that he is unobstructed. Why? Because history exists, right? History exists. If I were to draw a timeline, the timeline might look like this, right? And there would be like the 18th century, the 19th century, the masked man in the 20th century, on to infinity, right? But that history, in a very solid, or in a very abstract sense, doesn't really exist in a geographical world per se. History is an abstraction of human cognition, right? It is the dates and the events, it is the time, it is the era, but it's not something that can be quantified. It's not something that in itself is tangible, though if you want to talk about historical anthropology, historical sociology, fine. That is tangible, that is quantifiable, that is measurable. But history in its purest sense is an abstract concept. It's an abstract field of study. Like historical anthropology is not. It's something very, very, very tangible. What we recognize is what Gasset is referring to is history itself. This world that Gasset is talking about isn't the world within history, right? It is the actual geographical world. And what this does is it whets his appetite. Why? Because the masked man wants, in a very real sense, to expand his power, and he recognized that his presence gives him the opportunity to expand his power to do what? I hate to say it because it's so cliche, but it's so true. It is to rule the world, right? It's to rule the world. It's the ultimate fantasy for some, right? World domination, right? World domination by one individual, by the masked man. And how do you go about doing this? From Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte to Adolf Hitler, you always do this historically in means of conquest, right? You dominate, you subordinate, you conquer, you proselytize, you try and amass one world under the rule of one individual, and that world is a geographical world. Why? Because we recognize that when our time comes, and we all recognize that our time comes and that we die, in a very real sense, though we may not exist any longer, the ideologies that we left by, the ideologies that we leave behind, the ideologies that we erect, the ideologies and theories that we construct out of our sort of interpretive abilities live not in a geographical sense, they live in a historical sense. They live in this abstracted sense. And all it is a baton change from one Führer to the next Führer, from one person of power to the next person of power. So that all that there is a recognition of in this world view is the haves and the have-nots. Those who have power and those who do not. Those who aspire for greater power and those who aspire for none. And it's important to recognize that this potential whets the appetite of the masked man. The masked man wants total conquest and total domination of the world. And there isn't going to be a give and take. It's not going to be that some of the world is going to be able to be ruled by some other ideology or a person with a different ideological stance. It is that one ideology, one man in particular, is going to be in complete control of the world for a very real sense. And that is in itself problematic. So that, according to Gasset, the fourth characteristic of the masked man is that the masked man is unobstructed and insatiable. His appetite is incapable of being satisfied, and that's what he said, and that's what he means by his appetite, which in principle can increase indefinitely, right? His appetite for the world, for the physical structure and control of the world, can increase indefinitely. Okay. Number 5. The mass man is ungracious. He's ungracious. He has no, and we've seen this already in our discussion of gratitude, right? Gratitude has been supplanted by rights. Humility has been supplanted by rights. The ability to ask for has been supplanted by an insistence upon, right? And Gasset says the following with respect to gratitude and being gracious. He says the following: never thinks the common man, the mass man, never thinks of the personal efforts, and this is important, the personal efforts of highly endowed individuals, which the creation of this new world presupposed. And I'm actually going to spend some time discussing this because this becomes extremely complex, right? Still less will he admit the notion that all these facilities still require the support of certain difficult human virtues. The psychological chart of the mass man of today, two fundamental traits, right? Has two fundamental traits. The free expansion of his vital desire, and therefore of his personality, and we've seen that. So the free expansion of his desire, unlimited expansion of his desire. My desire has to be satisfied without obstruction, first. And second, and his radical ingratitude towards all that made possible the ease of his existence. All that made possible the ease of his existence. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's go back and read a little bit more. Still less will he admit the notion that all these facilities still require the support of certain difficult human virtues, the least failure of which would cause the rapid disappearance of the whole magnificent edifice. What in the world does that mean? You'll see this a little bit more clear in an upcoming section in chapter 6. This is a bit more complicated. This is profoundly more complicated. I'm just going to hint to it now because I don't want to give everything away just yet. We begin, and what I like about Gasset is he begins with this sort of three-tiered hierarchical account of the masses, right, and then the minority, and then the aristocracy, and then we talk about government, and then we talk about the mass man, right, so that it becomes increasingly more complicated, but beneath all of this is the support, right, is the support for this whole structure, so that this whole structure rests on the foundation, right, and all of this, we recognize then, is a consequence of, so that we get the full view of what he's saying, is a consequence of what Gasset calls circumstance. So that we've almost got the full picture of Gasset's sort of hierarchy, his ideological construction. Were he to have drawn it out, which he doesn't, but were he to have drawn it out over the series of multiple chapters, you would recognize that you have the masses as subordinate to the aristocracy, as superior to the minority, the government regulating and legislating, I think in chapter 3, both the aristocracy, the masses, and the minority, and that the mass man transcends the government itself as a product of the masses. And all of that is made possible by the totality of possibilities, which he calls, the totality of possibilities is circumstance. The question is, what's bedrock? What is this support? And we're going to try and figure out what that is. What we recognize, nevertheless, is that the last man is lacking gratitude, and the gratitude is the gratitude for this support, because he doesn't recognize the very thing that's holding him up, right? His position of dominance is presupposed by this structure, and we're going to figure out in a second what is this structure.